Imagine your wedding night not as a private moment of joy shared between two people, but as a public spectacle where dozens of strangers stare at you, silently observing every movement. Imagine that instead of choosing the person you love, you are forced into marriage when you are barely a child, only 12 years old, because your family needs to secure land, wealth, or political advantage. It sounds like a nightmare ripped from the darkest of stories, yet this was the brutal reality for millions living in medieval Europe. Marriage today is often painted as a celebration of love, companionship, and mutual respect. But if you rewind history to medieval times, you uncover a far darker story. The institution of marriage was stripped of romance and turned into a brutal tool of social control, economic strategy, and political power plays. Love was irrelevant. Consent was a formality at best. And behind the grand ceremonies lay a world where individuals, especially women, had little autonomy or freedom. The context: a society ruled by power and property. Medieval Europe was governed by a rigid social hierarchy, where land ownership, alliances, and family honor dictated nearly every life decision. In this context, marriage was less about the two individuals and more about cementing alliances between families, preserving or expanding landholdings, and strengthening political influence. Parents arranged marriages when their children were toddlers, sometimes even before they could walk or speak properly. This wasn't done in secret or whispered behind closed doors. These were public transactions, deeply entrenched in the culture and legal systems of the time. Imagine a 7-year-old child promised to a future spouse in a deal negotiated by parents or local lords. The child's feelings, thoughts, or even basic understanding of marriage were utterly irrelevant. The wedding day wasn't a start of a new life by choice, but the inevitable handover of a child from one authority figure, her father, to another, her husband. Consent? A word without meaning. The idea that marriage requires genuine consent is a relatively modern concept. The medieval church required verbal consent for a marriage to be valid, but in practice, this was often meaningless. Children, especially girls, as young as 12, were coerced or even forced to say yes. Pressure from relatives, threats, and sometimes physical violence ensured compliance. A hesitant or outright refusal was met with intimidation, or worse. In fact, the phrase "yes under" pressure still counted reveals how hollow consent really was. Women were expected not only to accept their fate, but to obey their husbands unquestioningly once married. The church reinforced this by emphasizing the wife's duty to submit, referencing biblical passages that positioned wives as subservient to their husbands. This obedience wasn't a gentle suggestion, but a strict societal expectation backed by religious authority. The public spectacle. Ownership on display. Medieval weddings were public affairs, designed to showcase alliances and assert control. The bride was not a partner but property to be handed over. The ritual where a father gave his daughter's hand to the groom symbolized the transfer of ownership, a legal act confirming she was no longer her father's but her husband's possession. Thieu, wedding veil, a tradition that has survived to modern times, held a very different meaning in medieval society. Rather than symbolizing modesty or purity, the veil was a tool of control and secrecy. Brides were kept veiled until the marriage vows were exchanged to prevent the groom from seeing her face beforehand. This protected the deal. Once the vows were said, rejection was not an option. The veil shielded the groom from making a choice based on appearance, emphasizing that the marriage was a contract rather than a romantic connection. Armed guards, often called the bride's guard or best man in historical contexts, stood watch during these ceremonies, not to hold rings or deliver speeches, but to enforce the union and prevent the bride from escaping. Their presence was a reminder that these marriages were not always peaceful or voluntary. Sometimes families quarreled, rivals tried to intervene, or brides resisted. The guards ensured the ceremony proceeded without disruption, highlighting the force underpinning these social contracts. The wedding was more than a ceremony. It was a performance of power. Lavish feasts, music, and public celebrations marked the occasion, showcasing wealth and status. Guests from nearby villages and even distant lands attended, reinforcing the social and political significance of the union. The positioning of the bride during the ceremony further reinforced her status. Standing on the groom's left side, she was visibly claimed. The exchange of rings, now a symbol of love and commitment, held a heavier meaning then. The ring was a sign of ownership, a clear declaration that the woman had been legally transferred to another man's authority. These rituals were a constant reminder that the bride's life, body, and future were controlled by others. Her identity was defined by her relationships with men, first her father, then her husband. This transfer was backed by law and religion, making it nearly impossible for women to assert independence. Behind the pomp and ceremony lay a harsh social order where women had no legal personhood. They could not own property, make decisions, or move freely without their husband's approval. Marriage solidified this transition. The bride was no longer a free individual, but a part of her husband's estate. This dynamic was not limited to noble families. Among peasants, weddings were simpler but followed the same patterns of control. The bride was handed over publicly, alliances were made, and the community witnessed the transfer of authority. The first night, proof and pressure. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect was the first wedding night. A woman's virginity was more than a personal matter. It was political and legal proof that any children she bore were legitimate heirs to property and power. The community demanded evidence, often in the form of blood-stained sheets displayed for all to see. Failure to produce such proof could ruin a woman's life, leading to shame, exile, annulment of the marriage, or worse. This invasive custom placed enormous pressure on brides. The idea of the rite of the first night, where a lord supposedly had the right to sleep with a peasant bride before her husband, though debated by historians, illustrates the extreme level of control imposed on women's bodies. Whether myth or reality, it reflects the fear and helplessness many must have felt. Why this matters today. Understanding these harsh realities isn't just about unearthing a grim past. It's about recognizing how deeply embedded control and inequality were in history. It highlights the precious freedoms we now have and the long struggle behind them. These stories remind us that marriage without consent, without respect, is a form of imprisonment, and they challenge us to protect and cherish the autonomy we enjoy today. As we journey through this video, you will see how medieval marriage was, less a union of hearts and more a battleground for power. It's a chapter of history filled with pain, injustice, and silence, but also one that holds lessons for our present and future. Stay with us, because the truth behind those sacred vows is darker and more shocking than you ever imagined. Imagine being told your life is already decided before you even understand what it means to grow up. Picture your childhood dreams crushed, replaced by promises made without your voice, agreements that chain you to a stranger for life. This was the cruel fate for many children born into medieval Europe's rigid social order. Medieval society was not built around individual freedom or romantic love. It was a place where family lineage, property, and power were the currencies of survival and success. Within this framework, marriage was a strategic contract, crafted and enforced by families for their own interests. The individuals getting married, the bride and groom, were rarely consulted or considered. Their futures were arranged by parents or local lords, often when they were toddlers or young children. These early promises, known as betrothals, were legally binding contracts. A child might be promised to a future spouse as young as 7 or 8 years old. Often they would grow up knowing their life path was already fixed. The idea of choosing one's own partner was not even a possibility. To refuse such an arrangement meant risking family honor, social standing, and economic security. The pressure to comply was immense. Families viewed these agreements as investments. Dowries, the wealth or property a bride's family gave to the groom's family, were part of the deal, ensuring that the marriage was financially advantageous. Likewise, bride prices could be paid by the groom's side as a form of guarantee. These transactions ensured both families had something to lose if the marriage failed. This made backing out nearly impossible without serious consequences, such as scandal or financial ruin. The Church's role complicated things further. While medieval canon law technically required both parties' consent for a marriage to be valid in reality, this consent was often coerced or fabricated. Children were pressured to say yes, sometimes under threats or even violence. The Church's insistence on verbal consent became a tool families used to legitimize forced marriages. Girls as young as 12 could be pressured or beaten until they complied, their silence and fear disregarded. The emotional cost for these children must have been profound. Imagine growing up knowing your body and your fate are not yours to control. Girls were taught from early childhood that their primary role was to obey, serve, and produce heirs. Boys learned their duty was to provide, protect, and claim their bride at the right time. They were raised to fulfill these social scripts, never questioning the system that confined them. When the time came, usually around 12 for girls and 14 for boys, these arranged marriages were formalized. In many cases, the bride and groom met for the first time on their wedding day. The shock and fear of facing a stranger, forced to live with them for life, is hard to imagine. Childhood. Innocence was sacrificed in a ceremony that was less about union and more about submission. The pressure to conform was absolute. If anyone tried to resist, whether the bride, groom, or their families, they faced severe backlash. Dowries could be forfeited, alliances broken, and reputations ruined. The social structure depended on maintaining these contracts. To break one was to invite disgrace, financial loss, and ostracism. This harsh reality trapped many in marriages they neither wanted nor understood. Even among peasants, marriage was an economic and social necessity rather than a choice. Families negotiated matches to combine land, labor, and resources to survive the hardships of medieval life. Personal feelings were secondary to the practical needs of survival. These childhood promises and lifelong bonds left a legacy of lost freedom, shattered hopes, and silenced voices. The system ensured that marriage served the interests of families and communities over the individuals trapped within them, especially women. Their lives became tools in a larger game of power and survival. Imagine your wedding day stripped of any romantic meaning, reduced to a public transaction where you as a person become property transferred from your father to your husband in front of an entire village. The ceremony is not a celebration of love, but a brutal assertion of control and power, watched by the eyes of your community, signaling your loss of freedom and your new role as a possession. This was the grim reality of medieval weddings. Medieval weddings were spectacles of social order, legal contracts, and political alliance, far from the private, personal celebrations we imagine today. These public ceremonies were orchestrated to announce and cement the transfer of authority over the bride, underscoring the deeply patriarchal structures governing medieval society. The most striking and telling ritual of these weddings was the giving away of the bride's hand by her father to the groom. Unlike the romanticized modern wedding gesture, this was a literal and symbolic transaction marking a change in ownership. The father's act of handing over his daughter was a legal declaration that she was no longer under his guardianship but was now the property of her husband. This moment was intentionally public and witnessed by the community to make the transfer official and irreversible. It was a transfer of power wrapped in ceremony. The significance of this act cannot be overstated. It reflected how women were legally viewed as possessions rather than independent individuals. In many medieval jurisdictions, women had little to no property rights of their own and could not make important decisions without male approval. The wedding was the moment their legal identity was subsumed under their husband's authority. The community's presence reinforced this reality, ensuring social compliance and preventing challenges to the transfer. The bridal veil, which today often symbolizes purity or modesty, held a very different and far more controlling meaning during the medieval period. The veil concealed the bride's face from her groom until the vows were exchanged. This concealment served a practical and symbolic purpose. It prevented the groom from rejecting the bride based on her appearance, ensuring that the contract was sealed before any personal preferences could intervene. The veil thus symbolized not innocence, but control and secrecy. The bride's identity was masked, and her personal worth was secondary to the political and economic alliance her marriage created. This control extended beyond symbolism to physical enforcement. The presence of armed guards, often called the bride's guard or best man, was common. These men were tasked with protecting the ceremony from disruption, preventing the bride from escaping, and deterring rivals or dissenters who might attempt to interfere. The guard's role underlined how marriages were sometimes contested, and that coercion and force were integral to maintaining social order. Their presence was a visible reminder of the power dynamics at play and the bride's limited agency. The wedding feast and festivities, while seemingly joyous, were laden with political meaning. Noble families used these occasions to display their wealth, power, and influence. Guests from neighboring villages, other noble families, and even distant lands were invited, transforming the wedding into a public declaration of alliances and social contracts. Musicians, dancers, elaborate meals, and banquets were part of the spectacle, designed not just to celebrate, but to affirm social hierarchies and publicize the union's political significance. The bride's placement during the ceremony further emphasized her subordinate status. Traditionally standing on the groom's left side, this position was a visual marker of her new role as claimed and under her husband's authority. The exchange of rings, which today symbolize love and mutual commitment, was then understood as a legal token of ownership and binding agreement, marking the woman's transfer into her husband's control. All these rituals reflected and reinforced a social order where women lacked legal independence. They could not own property, enter contracts, or travel without permission. Marriage was the legal mechanism through which their personhood was transferred and controlled. This subjugation was upheld by both civil and ecclesiastical law, making it nearly impossible for women to assert autonomy within marriage. While noble weddings were often extravagant, peasant weddings adhered to similar patterns on a more modest scale. The public transfer of a bride to her husband was witnessed by family and community members, affirming her new social role and binding the families together. This public acknowledgement was critical in rural communities where social cohesion and mutual obligation were essential for survival. The bride's transition was a community event marking shifts in social and economic relationships, ensuring that everyone recognized and upheld the new family arrangement. The highly public nature of medieval weddings served several functions beyond ceremony. It deterred dissent and rebellion from within the marriage by placing the couple under community scrutiny. Knowing that neighbors, friends, and relatives witnessed the transfer and expected compliance created immense social pressure to conform. These weddings were a form of social control, maintaining patriarchal norms and preventing individuals, particularly women, from challenging their prescribed roles. Understanding medieval weddings as theatrical displays of power and property, rather than romantic unions, forces a re-examination of popular historical narratives. It reveals the extent to which women were marginalized and commodified within their own societies. The lavish ceremonies and symbolic gestures masked a harsh reality of control, ownership, and limited freedom. For women, this meant living under constant surveillance and social expectation. Their bodies and choices were regulated by laws, customs, and religious dictates. Their marriages were alliances forged in power struggles, with personal happiness sacrificed to family strategy and social order. Imagine the pressure of knowing that your worth on your wedding night isn't measured by love or commitment, but by blood on a sheet. Picture that this blood isn't just a private matter. It's proof demanded by families, communities, and even the law to validate your entire marriage and your future children's legitimacy. For medieval brides, the first wedding night was a trial by fire, where their purity was scrutinized publicly, and their very survival could depend on it. In medieval Europe, a woman's virginity was more than a personal or moral concern. It was a political and legal necessity. The assurance that the children she bore were biologically her husband's was vital to preserving inheritance lines, family honor, and social order. Without modern science, the only proof was the bride's untouched status, signified by blood on the sheets after the consummation of marriage. This created an intense and invasive pressure on young women, whose bodies became battlegrounds for social legitimacy. The concept of virginity as proof of fidelity and legitimacy was deeply entrenched in medieval society. Nobles, who depended on clear lines of succession to maintain power and property, treated virginity tests as essential rituals. After the wedding night, it was customary in some regions for the blood-stained sheets to be displayed to the bride's family, or even shown publicly during the wedding feast. This exhibition was intended to silence any doubts about the bride's innocence and the legitimacy of future heirs. Failure to produce this proof could have devastating consequences. A bride suspected of not being a virgin faced social humiliation, rejection by her husband and in-laws, or even being cast out. In noble circles, the stakes were even higher. Accusations of impurity could lead to annulled marriages, loss of political alliances, or violent disputes between families. In extreme cases, questions about a queen's fidelity sparked civil wars, as illegitimate heirs threatened dynastic stability. For commoners, although the consequences might have been less politically explosive, the social fallout was brutal. A bride who failed the virginity test risked gossip, mockery, and exclusion from the community. Villages were tight-knit. Reputation was everything. A woman's honor was linked directly to her family's standing and her ability to secure her children's futures. Without the proof of virginity, a woman could be left destitute and vulnerable. This overwhelming focus on virginity reveals the degree to which women's bodies were controlled and politicized. Their value was measured not by their personality or capabilities, but by their purity and reproductive potential. The first wedding night was not a private, loving moment. It was a social obligation fraught with anxiety, surveillance, and fear. Further compounding this pressure was the belief in the so-called rite of the first night, jus primae noctis, a controversial custom supposedly allowing feudal lords to sleep with any peasant bride before her husband. While historians debate how widespread or real this practice was, its legend reflects the extreme level of control and dominance exerted over women's bodies. It symbolized the ultimate assertion of power, reminding peasants that their lives and bodies belonged to their lords as much as their families. In some regions, peasants paid fees to their lords to avoid this rite, indicating that even if the act was not routinely practiced, the threat and symbolism were very real. Church decrees banning the custom suggest it existed at least in some form. The fact that epic poems and legends openly reference the rite of the first night shows how deeply ingrained this belief was in the collective consciousness of medieval society. Beyond the first night, communal surveillance continued with rituals, like the bedding ceremony. Friends and family would accompany the couple to their marital bed, sometimes remaining nearby or even watching to ensure consummation took place. In places like Iceland and Germany, multiple witnesses or public celebrations accompanied these rites, further eroding the couple's privacy. The church tightly regulated physical intimacy within marriage, permitting it only for procreation. Sexual desire or pleasure was viewed with suspicion or outright condemnation. Abstinence was required on certain days and during religious periods. Women were expected to comply with their husband's marital debt, a religiously mandated obligation, without refusal, while men faced little similar pressure. In this grim framework, the bride's body was a site of control, surveillance, and obligation. From the moment of marriage, her primary social function was to bear children, especially sons, to secure family lineage and inheritance. The physical and emotional toll on women was immense, compounded by dangerous childbirth, conditions, and the relentless expectation to reproduce again and again. Imagine being forced into your wedding night with not just your new spouse but an entire room, or even a crowd, watching every intimate detail of your first moments together. Your privacy erased, your body and union scrutinized by relatives, neighbors, and even complete strangers. This was the reality for many couples in medieval Europe, where consummation of marriage was not just a personal milestone, but a public event bound by community control and religious oversight. The wedding night, far from being a private, sacred moment shared in love, was in medieval times a social obligation, marked by public ceremonies and strict surveillance. One of the most intrusive rituals was the bedding ceremony, in which friends, family, and sometimes entire communities would escort the newlywed couple to their marital bed. The act of consummating the marriage was observed, or at least monitored, by witnesses who ensured that the union was physically realized according to both societal expectation and church law. In some regions of Europe, these ceremonies involved a level of communal participation that can seem unfathomable today. In Iceland, for instance, it was customary for up to 6 men to witness the couple entering the bed, a necessary act to confirm the marriage's validity. In parts of Germany, neighbors would gather outside the bedroom, making noise with drums and pipes to drown out any sounds, yet serving as a reminder that the couple's private act was anything but private. This intense level of community involvement was deeply tied to social control. Consummation was required to cement the marriage legally and socially. Without it, the marriage could be contested or considered invalid. Given the enormous importance of producing legitimate heirs, the act of consummation was not just personal, but a public duty. The presence of witnesses was designed to prevent deceit and ensure that the marriage served its social function. The church reinforced this intrusion. Beyond demanding verbal consent, it set rigid guidelines about when and how physical intimacy could occur. Sex was permitted only for procreation and banned on specific days of the week, like Sundays, Thursdays, and Fridays, and during religious seasons such as Lent. Women were also expected to abstain during menstruation, breastfeeding, and for 40 days postpartum. The Church's strict regulation framed intimacy as a duty, stripping it of any aspect of personal desire or pleasure. Within this framework, the concept of the marital debt emerged. Husbands were entitled to demand sexual access to their wives who were socially and religiously obligated to comply. Refusing a husband's request could be considered sinful, while husbands faced little similar accountability. This imbalance institutionalized women's subjugation within marriage, reducing intimacy to an obligation rather than an expression of mutual affection. The social surveillance extended beyond the wedding night. The entire marital relationship was embedded within a system of control where women were expected to fulfill their reproductive roles despite the risks to their health and well-being. Childbearing was perilous, with many women dying during labor or from infections. Yet, the expectation to bear children, especially male heirs, remained relentless. For peasant women, the burden was heavier still. They were responsible not only for childbirth but also for maintaining households and working the land. Pregnancy did not excuse them from labor. Many carried water, harvested crops, and managed livestock even in late pregnancy. Their fertility was critical for family survival, with each child representing additional labor to sustain the household. This grueling reality starkly contrasted with the ideals the Church preached about sacred marriage and mutual respect. In Tapper practice, women's bodies were sites of control, their needs secondary to familial and social obligations. The bedding ceremony and its surrounding rituals symbolized how deeply intertwined physical intimacy, reproduction, and social surveillance were in medieval marriage. Imagine a life where your value is measured solely by how many children you can bear, especially sons. Imagine facing the constant physical toll of pregnancy and childbirth, with little rest and no medical care, while also being expected to maintain your household and labor in the fields. This was the unforgiving reality for medieval women, trapped in a cycle of duty, pain, and survival. In medieval society, a woman's primary role after marriage was to produce heirs. Her worth was inextricably tied to her fertility and her ability to bear male children who would carry on family names and inherit property. This expectation was relentless and unforgiving. The survival of families, especially noble houses, depended on producing legitimate male heirs to secure political alliances, preserve estates, and maintain power. Daughters, while still valuable for future alliances through marriage, could not provide the same level of security. For noble families, a son meant the continuation of the lineage, the protection of wealth, and the consolidation of influence. Pregnancy and childbirth were perilous endeavors. Medieval medical knowledge was limited, and there were no effective treatments for complications such as hemorrhaging, infection, or obstructed labor. Midwives and herbal remedies were common, but mortality rates for women during childbirth were high. Many women did not survive their first birth, and those who did often faced weakened health that affected subsequent pregnancies. Despite these risks, women were expected to bear multiple children, often 5, 10, or even 15 over their lifetimes. The pressure to produce heirs was unyielding. Each pregnancy and childbirth carried the threat of death, but women were expected to endure this cycle continuously. Their health and well-being were often secondary to their reproductive duties. Outside of pregnancy, women had grueling responsibilities. Peasant women, who formed the majority of the population, managed entire households, farmed fields, raised livestock, cooked, cleaned, spun wool, and cared for children. These tasks required immense physical strength and endurance, yet pregnancy was no excuse to shirk these duties. Women worked until the very day they gave birth and often resumed labor shortly thereafter. For noble women, while their daily physical labor might have been less intense, they held responsibilities as estate managers, overseeing servants, organizing household affairs, and hosting guests. Their role was critical in maintaining the family's social and economic status. The toll of this endless labor, physical, emotional, and social, was immense. Women had little time for rest or recovery. Their bodies were seen primarily as vessels for producing heirs and sustaining the household. Personal desires, health needs, or ambitions were rarely considered. Failure to produce a male heir could have dire consequences. Noble women who bore only daughters risked losing favor or being replaced by new wives. Public rejection or quiet dismissal was not uncommon. The fate of Queen Bertha of the Netherlands illustrates this harsh reality. Her husband, King Philip I of France, accused her of being too large and fat, but in reality she had failed to produce a son. He repudiated her despite the church's warnings, replacing her with another woman who could bear a male heir. Among peasants, the consequences were different, but no less severe. Women's fertility was essential to the family's survival and economic well-being. Each child represented additional labor for the household and a potential caretaker for the parents in old age. Losing a child meant fewer hands to work and greater hardship. The pressure to conceive again quickly was constant. Despite the dangers and hardships, society offered little support or relief. Women's suffering was often invisible or ignored. Their physical pain was accepted as part of their duty. The church preached submission and obedience, reinforcing the idea that bearing children was a sacred obligation. In this world, marriage was a relentless cycle of labor and reproduction, with women caught at its center. Their value was measured by their ability to endure hardship and produce heirs. The harsh realities of medieval marriage reveal a system designed to control and exploit women's bodies and lives for social and political ends.